In our last video, we started tearing apart the front suspension on the car just to give ourselves the best chance to go over everything and make sure to replace all the things that are worn out or rebuild the parts that are necessary. We did take the opportunity to make the trip up to our dealer not too long ago just so that they can go over our shocks and give us a better idea of whether or not they need to be rebuilt, which unfortunately our right sides were leaking enough to where they needed to be sent out for repair. So we figured we might as well get that knocked out as soon as we can, since the turnaround times are looking at about 3 to 4 months right now. So we definitely wanted to get those sent out as soon as possible if they were in need of a rebuild. Now luckily for us, we got to keep 2 of our shocks because our left side ones didn't seem to be leaking at all. So we're not going to send those out if they don't need to be. But unfortunately, we did need to send out our right sides because, like I said, they were leaking quite a bit. We also took the opportunity while we were up there to go ahead and pick up a new set of caliper seals just so we can go ahead and get through rebuilding them and, clean them up and whatnot, since in our last video, we did see how badly the right front pads wore unevenly, and hopefully this will give us a chance to go through and make sure that these are operating properly, and hopefully we don't have that issue again. We do right now have an extra set of pads that are very minimally used, but we may venture out to getting a brand new set just in case. Now this little organizer case is something that we've been working on for the last couple of days. All we're doing with this is just separating into each of the different bins all the bolts and spacers we should need while we're at the track, just so that we can replace things as needed and hopefully keep everything contained in a smaller footprint instead of having the little bags that you get whenever you pick up hardware from a store. And luckily for us, we do have a Fastenal here locally for us to give ourselves quite a bit of bolts when we need them. Unfortunately, we don't have a business account with them, so we do have to go through all the normal consumer stuff, but we are able to get a pretty decent batch of bolts whenever we do go. Now, part of the great debate is whether or not you choose to use grade 5 or grade 8 bolts. We'll tend to stick with grade 5 here over the grade 8 bolts because we like the idea of the bolt actually bending before fully snapping, because then it gives us the opportunity to, at the very least, back the bolt out. Whether it's not straight, as long as we can still back the bolt out and put a new one on, that's something that I'd rather take care of than having to try and drill out a hardened bolt and put an extractor kit on there and try and back it out. It just seems easier for us to take care of that way. But we ordered enough of these bolts to go through and replace every single bolt on the suspension side, aside from 1 or 2 bolts. And we were actually able to spend less than $100 to go through and get all of these bolts, plus some additional packages here for the bolts that we'll use for the bumpers, and all the bolts that we'll use for anything else that's the 3/8-16 bolts. So realistically, we should be pretty much good on bolts for the rest of the year. We'll obviously grab whatever onesie-twosie bolts we need to finish out the car, but definitely buying in this type of bulk will give you the best return. But buying bolts in such large quantities like this will typically give you the less cent per bolt, and even though you're buying such a large bag, it's really not all that terrible because it's more than likely you're going to use all of these within probably a year or two, depending on your track or how rough everyone around you is. But we decided to go with an organizer like this because it's definitely going to be nice to just have all of our bolts in one area and not have to worry about all the different places that our bolts could be. So this is definitely one of our biggest step ups for our program this year. We've also got bins for all of our suspension spacers and a couple of other bins for all of our washers, lock nuts, and what have you. So I'm sure this isn't going to be the final iteration of this box, and we'll more than likely grab a second one, probably specifically just for suspension bolts, and then another one just for everything else on the car that could potentially need to be replaced. These are also good for keeping some pretty small spare bits, such as some extra heim joints like we have right there, or just a couple of extra things that you may need at the track that you don't want just loosely flying around in a bin or whatever. So we've got all the bolts that we have on hand organized and separated into their own bins. We even went ahead and placed some labels with the correct thread pitch and their lengths, just so that we can go ahead and take a quick peek at them and not have to spend a ton of time trying to find a thread pitch gauge or anything like that. And you know, for the most part, as long as we know where they go in the car, it won't be a big deal. And I want to say it's very important that you go through the car during the off season and replace, at the very least, every single suspension bolt on the car, because right here you can see that this is actually a bolt we missed when we were going through our damage checkover from the Legend Invasion, because if you remember, we actually got caught up in an incident during the first night where we ended up colliding with the 48 with both of our right fronts, and it messed up our toe quite a bit. But for whatever reason, I didn't think to check our lower control arm bolt back here on the chassis. And if you take a decent look, you can see how much the bolt is oscillating, and it is bent pretty severely. Go ahead and give you a decent peek here. So obviously this is a grade 8 bolt, and it did bend a little bit, but I'm afraid that if it has any more stress on it, it would snap, and you can see how much the threads are deviated. So obviously this bolt is no good to us, and is definitely something that we will look at in the future anytime a collision like that happens. That was probably just a lapse in judgment on our part, but we'll go ahead and grab a new bolt with the same length. Make sure we throw our spacer back on there, and then we'll go ahead and get it back on the car, and then go ahead and tighten it down. So unfortunately, it does look like it may have damaged the threads on the inside, which honestly aren't all that big of a deal. We'll go ahead and back this bolt out, and I have something a little bit special for that. Now luckily for us, we actually have a tap in the 1/2 inch by 13 thread pitch, so that we can just kind of very carefully start getting this in. And then once we are on a couple of threads there, go ahead and give it some decent little bit of lubrication. Throw our ratchet on, and then just slowly go in little by little, making sure not to force it, because we're just cleaning up the threads because they were a little bit damaged from the collision, but we're not trying to make completely new threads. And then once you feel like it's getting kind of tight, go ahead and back out a little bit. Spray some more lubricant, and then continue. And then after you're done going through with the tap and chasing those threads, you can go ahead and get our new bolt started, and then chase it in the rest of the way. Goes all the way in, no problems, and now those threads are straight enough to hold a bolt. So we'll go through all of the suspension bolts through the entire car and go ahead and replace them with the new bolts we just ordered. Now obviously you can tell that I didn't show replacing the 2 lower control arm bolts on the cross member or the 2 bolts that are attached to the steering rack. And that's just because I can't really get a camera in there while I'm trying to pull them off very well. So it's probably something I'm not going to show on here, but just know that I am changing those out. And obviously it takes no effort at all to change out all these bolts. And like I said, it's cheap insurance. You want to make sure that all the bolts you put in are not only quality, but are relatively fresh, because these are all the bolts that we pulled off right here. While none of them look terrible, you never know how long these were on the car for or how much stress that they can handle in the future. So you always want to play it safe with these, because ultimately this is the link between your car being grounded pretty well and having no control whatsoever. But we'll go over the rear end here as well, get all these bolts swapped out, and then that'll likely be the end of this video. So this bolt right here, the one that leads our left trailing arm, is probably one of my least favorite bolts to get to. It's definitely one of the hardest ones to get to. But there's 2 main ways you can get to it. One of them is only accessible with a big boy chassis. Since our sheet metal is cut right here, you can actually come right in from the rear end with a wrench, hop right on that bolt, and just start working on it slowly but surely. Now the other way to get to it is by coming in from the inside of the car. This right here is our seat mounted in the car, and you can see right in here is right where our bolt is. And you can see there's not a whole lot of room really to get back there. So typically what I like to do is either get in there with a ratcheting wrench and just try and back it out as much as I can, or get in here with an electric ratchet and just try and make sure that I have the room to pull the bolt out, and then also have enough room to get my ratchet out and not have it get stuck. Now getting this bolt in can sometimes be nothing short of a miracle. Definitely not an ideal spot to hit if you have a wider seat like we do. But as long as you're patient with it, it's not the end of the world. And eventually we'll have it on and tight. So we've already come through the right side here and taking care of all the bolts that we were able to replace. Unfortunately, we weren't able to replace this trailing arm bolt just yet because it's a 3-inch bolt right now, and I'd like to replace it with a similar length, because right here we're able to put on a thin-walled nylock nut so that we can keep it from backing out. So I will go to the store and grab another bolt at some point, but it probably won't be in a video since it's only 1 bolt. But we have gone ahead and gone through, replaced all the bolts for our shocks here, the rear section of the trailing arm, as well as the panhard bar right there. And off camera, we also took care of our 3rd link right here, the upper link. You know, going through replacing these. This one's kind of tough because the rear end will want to lean back on you from all the weight it has, but it's not too bad. All you gotta do is stick a jack under it and it'll keep it in the right spot for the most part. But as of right now, every bolt except for that trailing arm bolt has been replaced. And like I said, it's cheap insurance. Doing all the suspension bolts cost us right about 20 to 30 bucks. And we were honestly able to stay in really 2 size groups. All of our bolts are either 2-inch or 2.5 inch long, aside from that one trailing arm bolt that stands in at 3 inches. I may go through the rear and change out some of those 3rd link bolts just to see if I can get them a little longer and throw a nylock nut on the back of those. But for the most part, all of our suspension bolts on the chassis have been replaced. Obviously, there's the 2 shock bolts on our lower control arms that we'll still need to replace, but everything's good. We'll also need to replace the bolts that connect the upper control arm together. So obviously we'll go through and take care of that. And we'll probably go through and replace these brake caliper bolts as well when we get the chance. But like I said, this is probably the easiest thing you can do during the off season to make sure your car is ready for the new season. This doesn't replace having to do the nut and bolt check every week to make sure that none of the bolts are backing out, but it is nice to have new hardware on the car throughout. While we were replacing bolts, obviously anything that has a nut on the back end typically will have a nylock nut on them. And we decided to actually reuse every single one of them that we have because the insert on these nuts are still good and they were grabbing onto the bolt with no problem. Obviously we'll check those periodically throughout the season. Now these nylock nuts are probably some of my favorites because they're super thin walled and the right thread pitch and all that for all of our suspension bolts. Definitely nice considering that with a normal nylock nut we would not be able to get it on the remaining threads to actually do its purpose. So definitely really like these thin walled ones. But that's all I've really got for you guys today. Obviously we still missed that one bolt on the trailing arm and we still need to replace a couple of other bolts around the chassis, such as our motor mount bolts and the bolts that hold on the radiator, but those I feel like aren't as important right now as the suspension bolts were. So we really wanted to make sure we knocked those out early and give ourselves the best chance of surviving the first weekend. We're definitely glad that we finished up with that. This right here is the box of all the bolts that we pulled off today. So definitely a good haul. We did have that one that was pretty severely bent, but it's more than likely that all of these are just gonna go in the scrap bucket, so there's no sense in keeping them. Obviously we went over earlier that we ended up going to our dealer, dropping off our shocks and getting those sent out. And we also were able to pick up the Wilwood rebuild kit, so hopefully we'll be able to do that in one of our next videos. But for now, that's all I've got for you. I appreciate you guys watching and I hope to catch you in the next one.